The slap echoed louder than the music. For one strange second, nobody in that ballroom moved. Not the caterers carrying silver trays, not the string quartet near the windows, not the 200 guests sitting beneath crystal chandeliers overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. Not even me. I just stood there in my white wedding gown with my head turned sideways from the force of Daniel's hand. My future husband had slapped me in front of everyone, and his mother smiled. I still remember the smell of cigarette smoke floating through the ballroom when it happened. Sharp, bitter, thick enough to sting my lungs. I had only asked politely, "Mrs. Whitmore, would you mind smoking outside? My lungs have been sensitive lately." That was it. I said it softly, respectfully. But Daniel suddenly exploded like a man waiting his entire life for an excuse. "Shut up," he shouted. The entire room froze. "You smell worse than cigarettes." Then came the slap. I heard several women gasp. Someone dropped a champagne glass near the dance floor. My cheek burned instantly, but honestly the pain wasn't what shocked me. It was the humiliation. At 42 years old, after 21 years in the United States Navy, after surviving deployments, toxic smoke exposure overseas, and the deaths of men I respected deeply, I had never felt smaller than I did standing there in my wedding dress. And the worst part, a piece of me wasn't even surprised. Because deep down I think I had spent the last 3 years pretending not to see who Daniel really was. 5 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened. And everything changed. But before I tell you about that moment, you need to understand how I ended up standing at that altar in the first place. My name is Rebecca Lawson. Commander Rebecca Lawson, technically. Though most people simply call me Becca. I grew up outside Norfolk, Virginia, in a modest blue-collar family. My father repaired electrical systems at the shipyard, and my mother worked the front desk at a dentist's office for nearly 30 years. We weren't poor, but we counted every dollar. My father believed in 3 things: show up early, work hard, and never complain. The Navy became my path out of a small life. I enlisted at 19. By 25, I was an officer. By 40, I had spent more birthdays overseas than at home. The Navy gave me structure, purpose, and honestly, family. But military life can also leave people lonely in ways civilians don't always understand. Especially women. Especially older women. You spend decades moving from base to base while other people build homes, raise children, host backyard cookouts, and celebrate anniversaries. Meanwhile, you become very good at saying goodbye. I met Daniel Whitmore at a charity fundraiser in Annapolis 4 years before the wedding. He was handsome in that polished East Coast way. Expensive watch, confident smile, tailored Navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. He owned a financial consulting company with his cousin. At first, he made me feel admired. After years around military culture where emotions stayed tightly controlled, Daniel felt warm and charming. He brought flowers, opened doors, held my hand in public. And after enough lonely years, that kind of attention can feel dangerous. Looking back now, the warning signs appeared early. Very early. The first time Daniel met my Navy friends, he joked, "So which one of you actually does the fighting?" Everybody laughed politely except me. Then there were little comments. "You'd look prettier if you wore your hair longer. Do you really need to work this much at your age?" A man wants peace when he comes home, not another commanding officer. Most of those comments came from his mother, Linda Whitmore. Linda belonged to one of those wealthy Maryland families that quietly measured human worth through money, appearances, and social status. She smiled often, but never kindly. The first time I visited their waterfront home, she looked at my uniform photo and said, "Oh my, Rebecca, you've certainly lived an unconventional life." Unconventional. That word stayed with me. Linda believed military women were masculine, aggressive, and unsuitable for marriage. She never said it directly. Women like Linda never do. Instead, they poison slowly. Tiny comments over dinner, passive little insults hidden inside compliments. "You're very impressive for someone with such a stressful career." Daniel has always needed softness in a woman. I just worry military life makes people emotionally hard. Daniel never defended me. Not once. And somehow I kept excusing it. Because loneliness can make intelligent people tolerate things they normally wouldn't. Especially after 40. Especially after years of watching everybody else build families while you unpack another suitcase alone in another temporary apartment. By the time we became engaged, I already knew something felt wrong. But I convinced myself marriage required compromise, patience, understanding. I told myself Linda would eventually warm up to me. I told myself Daniel's temper came from stress. I told myself many lies. The wedding took place in early October at a historic waterfront hotel in Annapolis. Beautiful weather, cool breeze off the water, golden leaves drifting near the marina. Nearly 200 guests attended, including several Navy officers I had served beside for years. Most of them sat quietly toward the back, because Daniel never liked attention focused on my military career. He once told me tonight is about us, not the Navy. Still, a few came because they loved me. One of them was Admiral Thomas Avery, a respected two-star admiral nearing retirement. He had mentored me for nearly 15 years. Truthfully, he was more protective of me than Daniel ever was. The reception started smoothly enough. Dinner, champagne, soft jazz music. Then Linda lit a cigarette near the bridal table, inside the ballroom. I noticed immediately because cigarette smoke still affects my breathing after toxic exposure during a deployment years ago near the Persian Gulf. Most people around me knew that. Linda definitely knew. She exhaled smoke slowly while watching me, almost like a test. I tried ignoring it at first, but after several minutes my chest tightened, so I leaned forward gently and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, would you mind smoking outside? My lungs have been sensitive lately." I smiled when I said it. I truly did. Then Daniel stood up so violently his chair nearly fell backward. "Shut up," he barked. The room went silent. "You smell worse than cigarettes?" And then, the slap. I remember the taste of blood inside my mouth. I remember Linda smiling into her wine glass. I remember hearing one elderly woman whisper, "Oh my God." And then, 5 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened. 12 Navy officers walked inside wearing full dress uniforms, and behind them, Admiral Avery stepped into the room. Daniel's face turned white. The ballroom became so quiet I could hear the water outside hitting the docks below the hotel. 12 Navy officers stood near the entrance in formal dress whites, their medals catching the chandelier light. And behind them stood Admiral Thomas Avery, 6'3", silver-haired, straight posture that somehow made the entire room sit taller the second he entered. I saw several guests immediately recognize the stars on his shoulders. People who had been whispering moments earlier suddenly fell silent. Daniel's face drained of color beside me, because for the first time that evening he realized something important. He had absolutely no idea who I really was. Admiral Avery walked directly toward me without looking at anyone else. Not Daniel, not Linda, not the guests, only me. Every Navy officer in the room stood immediately. A few civilians copied them awkwardly after realizing something serious was happening. The Admiral stopped inches from me and looked carefully at the red mark forming across my cheek. His jaw tightened. "Commander Lawson," he said quietly, "are you all right?" Commander Lawson, not Rebecca, not Becca. My rank, my identity, the one thing I had spent years shrinking to protect Daniel's fragile ego. I swallowed hard before answering. "Yes, sir," but my voice shook slightly. The Admiral noticed. He always noticed. Daniel suddenly forced an uncomfortable laugh. "Admiral Avery, right?" he said, stepping forward too quickly. "I'm Daniel, Rebecca's fiancé." Was. Not fiancé. Not anymore, though I don't think any of us understood that fully yet. The Admiral turned slowly toward him. His expression stayed calm but cold, very cold. "I'm aware of who you are," he replied. Then his eyes moved briefly toward my cheek again. That silence lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like 3 hours. Behind the Admiral, I noticed Commander Elise Monroe standing near the entrance. We had served together overseas years earlier. Beside her stood Captain Raymond Brooks, one of the sharpest logistics officers I'd ever known. These weren't random guests. These were respected officers. People who had spent decades serving this country, and every one of them had just witnessed Daniel slap me. Linda finally spoke, her voice syrupy and fake. "Oh dear, I'm sure this is all just wedding stress." Nobody answered her, not even Daniel. The Admiral looked back at me. "Would you like to step outside for some air, Commander?" The truth is, at that moment I wanted to disappear. Not because of the slap, but because I suddenly saw my entire life from the outside. A 42-year-old Navy commander standing in a ballroom beside a man who had publicly humiliated her. And somehow I had almost married him. I nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." As we started walking, Daniel grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but possessively. "Rebecca," he hissed quietly, "don't make this dramatic." Something inside me shifted when he said that. Because my humiliation wasn't the problem to him. His embarrassment was. I gently pulled my hand away. And for the first time in years, I stopped trying to soothe him. The hotel balcony overlooked the harbor. Boats rocked quietly in the dark water below while cold October wind swept across the marina. Admiral Avery stood beside me near the railing. For a while neither of us spoke. Then he said softly, "I should have said something sooner." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He folded his hands behind his back. "The way that man talks to you." I stared out at the water. "He's not always like that." The Admiral gave me a look older people recognize immediately. The look that says, please don't lie to yourself in front of me. Rebecca, he said gently, I've known you 15 years, and that was true. Thomas Avery had watched me grow from a nervous young lieutenant into a commander trusted during international evacuation operations. He knew me better than most people ever had. He knew about the deployment that damaged my lungs. Kuwait, oil fire smoke and chemical exposure after an attack near one of our temporary operational sites. I spent weeks coughing blood afterward. The Navy covered my treatments quietly, but the damage never fully disappeared. Certain smoke still triggered breathing problems, like cigarette smoke. Linda knew that. Daniel knew that too. Neither cared. You know what bothers me most, I finally whispered. The Admiral waited. I wasn't shocked when he hit me. Saying the words out loud made my stomach twist. Not shocked. Because somewhere deep inside, I think I had spent years preparing emotionally for the day Daniel's temper crossed that line. It hadn't started physically. Men like Daniel rarely begin there. First comes the disrespect, the sarcasm, the small humiliations disguised as jokes, then isolation, then emotional control. Then one day the line disappears. I closed my eyes briefly. There were signs, I admitted. The Admiral nodded once. Yes. And strangely, hearing somebody confirm it brought relief instead of shame. Because older women especially are taught to explain away bad behavior. He's stressed. He didn't mean it. He had a rough childhood. You know how men are. But deep down, most women know. I certainly did. I remembered the first deployment Daniel mocked. I had just returned from coordinating civilian evacuations during a dangerous operation overseas. 3 straight days with almost no sleep. I was exhausted, emotionally drained. When I told him how difficult it had been watching terrified families board transport aircraft, he rolled his eyes and said, "You military people always act like you're saving the world." Another time he complained because I missed one of his business dinners during an emergency briefing at the Pentagon. "You care more about strangers than your own relationship," he snapped. At the time I apologized. God help me, I apologized. The Admiral leaned slightly against the railing beside me. "You know why your officers respect you?" he asked. I shook my head faintly. "Because you protect people under pressure." His voice stayed calm. "You walk into chaos and make others feel safe." I looked down at my wedding ring. Suddenly it felt heavy. Embarrassing, like a symbol of every compromise I made against my own instincts. Inside the ballroom, music had completely stopped now. Guests were murmuring nervously. I could see silhouettes moving near the windows, watching. The Admiral turned toward me fully. "Commander," he asked carefully, "do you want us to stay?" Not forcefully, not controlling. Just support, real support. And for the first time all evening, I realized I didn't want Daniel comforting me. I didn't even want him near me. Slowly, I slid the wedding ring off my finger. My hands trembled slightly from adrenaline. Then I looked back toward the ballroom doors, toward the man who slapped me in front of 200 people. And I finally understood something that took me 42 years to learn. Loneliness had made me tolerate things self-respect never should have allowed. I closed my hand around the ring. Then I answered softly, "Yes, sir." The moment I walked back into that ballroom without my wedding ring on, people knew. Nobody needed an announcement. Nobody needed explanations. At my age, you learn people can sense when something permanent has broken. The string quartet had stopped playing completely. Champagne glasses sat untouched on tables. Even the hotel staff looked nervous. Daniel stood near the center of the dance floor, trying desperately to appear calm, while sweat gathered along his forehead. His mother stood beside him, clutching her cigarette with stiff fingers, though she had finally stopped smoking after several guests glared at her. The second Daniel saw me returning with Admiral Avery and the other officers behind me, his expression shifted. The anger disappeared. Now came charm, manipulation, damage control. "Baby," he said quickly, forcing a laugh, "come on, don't embarrass me like this." Embarrass him. That phrase settled into my chest heavier than the slap itself. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not even I lost control. Just fear about himself. His image. His reputation. I looked around the ballroom slowly. 200 people watching. Some uncomfortable. Some angry. Some pretending not to stare. And suddenly I felt strangely calm. For years I had feared public humiliation. Feared becoming the older woman people whispered about. Feared failed relationships. Feared ending up alone. But standing there in front of everybody, something unexpected happened. I stopped being afraid. Linda stepped forward with a brittle smile. "Rebecca," she said sweetly, "you're upset right now. Let's not ruin the evening over one little misunderstanding." One little misunderstanding. That woman could have watched a house burn down and still called it an unfortunate inconvenience. I looked directly at her for the first time without trying to earn her approval. You smiled when he hit me, I said quietly. Her expression twitched. Only slightly. But enough. Daniel immediately interrupted. Oh my God, Rebecca, stop making this dramatic. That word again. Dramatic. Funny how people always call women dramatic when women finally stop accepting disrespect. I took a slow breath. Then I heard my own voice say something I never imagined saying at my wedding. The wedding is over. Complete silence. Somebody near the back gasped softly. Daniel blinked at me like he genuinely thought he'd misunderstood. What? The wedding, I repeated calmly, is over. Linda laughed once in disbelief. Oh, don't be ridiculous. But I wasn't speaking emotionally anymore. That frightened them more than tears would have. I reached down and placed my wedding ring gently on the bridal table beside the flower centerpiece. No throwing, no screaming, no scene. Just finality. Daniel's face darkened instantly. You're seriously doing this, he hissed. I met his eyes steadily. You slapped me in front of 200 people. You provoked me. There it was. The sentence almost every abusive man eventually says. You provoked me. Several guests visibly reacted to that, especially the older women. I noticed one elderly woman at table 7 slowly shaking her head with visible disgust. Her husband leaned toward Daniel and said quietly but firmly, Son, a real man never hits a woman. Daniel ignored him completely, because men like Daniel never listen once their ego takes over. They only escalate. You think you're perfect? He snapped at me now. You think everybody here doesn't know how cold you are? I stayed silent. He stepped closer. You care more about your Navy career than relationships? Everybody knows it. I almost answered defensively out of habit. Years of habit. Years of explaining myself. But then something inside me simply stopped. Because suddenly I understood no explanation would ever be enough for someone determined to diminish me. The Admiral stepped slightly forward beside me. Not aggressively. Just enough. Daniel noticed immediately. And for the first time all evening I saw fear flicker across his face. Not guilt. Fear. Because now the room no longer saw him as the successful, charming businessman. Now they saw what he truly was, a man who struck his bride in public. And people over 60 especially understand something younger generations sometimes forget. Character eventually reveals itself under pressure. Always. Daniel lowered his voice. Rebecca, he muttered, please don't destroy everything over one mistake. Destroy everything. Again, not concern for me. Concern for himself. His lifestyle. His image. His future. And suddenly I saw our entire relationship clearly. The luxury dinners. The country club parties. The polished photos online. The expensive vacations. Underneath all of it sat one simple truth. Daniel needed admiration more than love. And I had spent years trying to become smaller so he could feel bigger. I looked around the ballroom one last time. The cake. The flowers. The orchestra. Thousands of dollars spent on a wedding that suddenly felt like theater. Then my eyes landed on Commander Elise Monroe near the entrance. She gave me the smallest nod. Not pity. Respect. That nearly broke me emotionally. Because I realized I had received more genuine support from fellow officers than from the man I was about to marry. Daniel reached toward me again. This time I stepped back before he touched me. The movement shocked him. Because I had spent years accommodating him automatically. Apologizing automatically. Softening automatically. Not anymore. I'm leaving, I said calmly. Linda scoffed loudly. Oh, please. Where exactly are you going to go at your age? That sentence hit hard. Not because it was true. Because it revealed exactly how she viewed women. As people who should tolerate misery rather than face solitude. I looked at her steadily. At my age, I said quietly, peace matters more than appearances. For the first time all evening, Linda had no response. I bent down, slipped off my high heels and held them in one hand. The marble floor felt cold beneath my feet as I walked toward the ballroom exit. And strangely, every step felt lighter. Behind me I heard Daniel calling my name. Then louder. Then angrily. But I kept walking. The Navy officers walked beside me silently as we moved through the hotel hallway. Nobody rushed me. Nobody pressured me. Outside, cold autumn air hit my face. I inhaled deeply. And for the first time in years, breathing felt easier than it had inside that ballroom. Then suddenly flashing red and blue lights reflected across the hotel windows. 3 police cruisers pulled into the circular driveway. Daniel stepped outside behind us just as 2 officers exited their vehicles. And the look on his face told me something important. For the first time that night, he understood actions had consequences. The police officers entered the hotel lobby with the calm expression people develop after years of handling domestic disturbances. Steady, professional, unemotional. But the moment Daniel saw them approaching, his confidence cracked. Are you serious right now? He snapped loudly, looking around the crowd. Who called the police? Nobody answered him. One of the officers, a gray-haired sergeant who looked close to retirement age himself, stepped forward calmly. "Sir, we received reports of an assault." Daniel immediately pointed toward me. "She's blowing this out of proportion." Out of proportion. Funny phrase. As if being struck in front of 200 people was a misunderstanding over dinner reservations. The officer looked at me gently. "Ma'am, are you injured?" My cheek still burned. But emotionally I felt strangely detached now, almost exhausted. "I'm all right," I answered quietly. Before Daniel could speak again, a woman near the hotel entrance raised her phone. "I recorded it," she said firmly. Another guest lifted his hand. "So did I." Then another voice. "I saw the whole thing." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Because public humiliation works both ways. Daniel had slapped me publicly. Now witnesses existed publicly too. Linda suddenly stepped forward wearing that same polished social smile. "Officers, surely we can handle this privately. Emotions are high tonight." The older sergeant looked at her for about 2 seconds before replying, "Ma'am, assault is assault. Simple. Direct. No performance." Daniel ran both hands through his hair aggressively. "Oh my God," he muttered, "this is insane." But deep down I think he already understood something important. His usual charm wasn't working anymore. Men like Daniel survive through image management, confidence, control. But once enough people witness the truth simultaneously, the mask collapses fast. One officer quietly asked whether I wanted to file an official complaint. I hesitated, not because I doubted what happened, because older generations, especially women my age, were raised to avoid becoming the reason for public scandal, even after being hurt. Even after humiliation. We were trained to preserve peace at our own expense. Admiral Avery spoke quietly beside me. "You don't owe anybody silence." That sentence settled deeply into me. You don't owe anybody silence. For years I had confused endurance with strength. But they aren't the same thing. Not even close. I finally nodded. "Yes," I said softly, "I'd like to make a statement." Daniel stared at me like I had betrayed him. Not because he regretted hurting me, because consequences had arrived. So, an hour later, most guests had quietly left the hotel. The wedding reception had dissolved into scattered flower petals, abandoned champagne glasses, and exhausted staff members cleaning tables beneath dimmed chandeliers. I sat in a private conference room with a police officer taking my statement while Admiral Avery waited outside. The female officer interviewing me appeared somewhere in her late 50s. Calm eyes. "Wedding ring," gentle voice. When I finished speaking, she closed her notebook slowly and asked, "Has he ever put his hands on you before?" I stared down at the table. "No." Then after a pause, "Not exactly." She waited carefully. There were other things, I admitted quietly. I began describing moments I had buried for years. Daniel grabbing my arm too tightly during arguments, blocking doorways, punching walls, mocking my military service, calling me cold, unfeminine, emotionally damaged. The officer listened without interruption. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "I've heard stories like this for 30 years, she said gently. "It almost always starts long before the first slap." That sentence stayed with me. Because she was right. The slap wasn't the beginning. It was the reveal. Over the next several days, the fallout spread quickly through Annapolis social circles. Somebody leaked one of the wedding videos online. Not the slap itself at first, just the aftermath. Daniel shouting, me standing silently, Navy officers surrounding the situation. Then eventually the actual video surfaced. I never watched it. I couldn't. But others did. Thousands of others. Veterans groups began sharing outrage online after learning Daniel had struck a senior Navy officer during her wedding reception. Several local news stations contacted the hotel asking questions. Daniel's business partners stopped returning his calls. One investor publicly withdrew from an upcoming development project. And suddenly the same wealthy people who once adored Daniel started distancing themselves quietly. That's another thing older people understand well. Many social circles are built entirely on convenience, not loyalty. Convenience. Linda called me 3 days later. I almost ignored it. But curiosity won. The second I answered, she sighed dramatically. "Rebecca," she said, "haven't we all suffered enough?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "How are you holding up?" Just concern about discomfort. I closed my eyes briefly. "Your son hit me. He was emotional. He assaulted me." Linda's voice hardened immediately. "You humiliated him in front of everyone." There it was again. Not concern for morality. Concern for image. I suddenly understood something chilling about that family. They didn't measure right versus wrong. Only embarrassment versus convenience. Before hanging up, Linda said one final thing. "You never knew how to let a man feel respected." I almost laughed. Because for years I had sacrificed pieces of myself trying to protect Daniel's ego. and it still wasn't enough. Nothing ever would have been. A week later, I drove to visit Margaret Holloway, retired Navy widow, 78 years old, sharp-minded, blunt. She had mentored countless younger military women over the decades, including me. Margaret lived alone in a quiet cottage outside Norfolk with an old golden retriever named Charlie sleeping near the fireplace. She poured coffee into 2 mugs while I explained everything. Not once did she interrupt. When I finally finished, she leaned back slowly in her chair. "Loneliness," she said softly, "can make strong women tolerate weak love." I stared at my coffee silently, because that sentence hit too close to the truth. Margaret studied me carefully. "You spent your whole adult life being needed," she continued. "That kind of life can make being chosen feel more important than being respected." I felt tears threaten my eyes for the first time since the wedding. Not from humiliation anymore, from recognition. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. "Rebecca," she said, "peace is not loneliness." That sentence changed something inside me, because maybe I had confused the two for years. When I left Margaret's cottage that evening, the sky had already turned dark over the water. I sat inside my car for several minutes before starting the engine. Then my phone rang. "Daniel." I almost declined the call, but something told me to answer. His voice sounded different immediately, less arrogant, more desperate. "There's something you don't know," he said quietly. I frowned. "What are you talking about?" A long silence followed. Then he said, "It's about your father." I didn't speak for several seconds after Daniel mentioned my father. The line stayed quiet except for faint traffic noise somewhere behind him. "What about my father?" I finally asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Can we meet in person?" Every instinct told me not to. But another part of me, the same part that had spent years searching for closure in broken places, needed answers. We agreed to meet the next afternoon at a quiet seafood restaurant overlooking the marina in Annapolis. The kind of place older couples visit after church on Sundays. Simple white tablecloths, lemon water, soft Frank Sinatra playing through ceiling speakers. When I arrived, Daniel was already seated in a corner booth. And honestly, he looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, wrinkled shirt, no confidence, no polished businessman charm. Just a tired man watching his life unravel. For a brief moment I almost pitied him. Then I remembered his hand across my face, the humiliation, Linda smiling, and the feeling disappeared. Daniel stood awkwardly when I approached. "Thanks for coming." I sat down carefully across from him. "What about my father?" He rubbed his hands together nervously. "I didn't want to tell you this before the wedding." "Tell me what?" He hesitated, then finally said, "Linda hired a private investigator after we got engaged." I stared at him. My stomach tightened immediately. "She became obsessed with your family background," he continued quietly. "She thought your father had hidden debts or gambling problems." I felt anger rise slowly through my chest. "My father worked 38 years in a shipyard," I said coldly. "He died with less than $500 in his checking account." "I know. Then why investigate him?" Daniel looked down at the table. "Because my mother believes poor people are dangerous." The sentence didn't even shock me anymore. It simply confirmed everything I already knew. Daniel swallowed hard. "The investigator found medical records from years ago." I frowned slightly. "What records?" He looked genuinely uncomfortable now. "Your father knew your lung damage was getting worse after your deployment." My chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" Daniel leaned forward carefully. "He tried contacting specialists before he died." I stared at him silently, because suddenly memories returned. My father insisting I stop ignoring my coughing. My father asking questions about military hospitals. My father sounding worried during phone calls I barely had time to answer. At the time I thought he was simply being protective. But apparently, it was more than that, Daniel continued quietly. "He spent most of his retirement savings trying to find treatment options for you." I looked away toward the harbor windows. My father had died 3 years earlier from a heart attack. We never got to have one final meaningful conversation. Military life stole too many of those chances. I swallowed carefully. "Why are you telling me this now?" Daniel's answer came too quickly. "Because I don't want you thinking I'm a monster." There it was. Not remorse. Self-preservation. Again. I looked back at him steadily. "You slapped me in public." His jaw tightened. "You humiliated my mother." I almost laughed at the insanity of that sentence. I asked her not to smoke near my damaged lungs. "She's old-fashioned." "She's cruel." Daniel's eyes hardened slightly. "You always hated her." "No," I said calmly. "I spent years trying to earn approval she never intended to give." That shut him up briefly. The waitress arrived with coffee neither of us touched. Outside sailboats drifted quietly through gray afternoon water. Finally Daniel leaned back heavily. You know what your problem is, Rebecca? I almost smiled. There it was. The real Daniel returning. My problem. You make people feel small. The sentence lingered between us. And suddenly, I understood him completely. Not just his anger, his resentment, his insecurity, everything. Daniel had never truly loved my strength. He loved being associated with it. The uniform, the status, the discipline, the admiration people showed me. But privately, my accomplishments made him feel inadequate. You know what's ironic? I asked quietly. He frowned. I spent years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. Daniel looked away immediately, because he knew it was true. I continued softly. I apologized for my career, my deployments, my responsibilities, my schedule, my promotions. You were never home, he muttered defensively. I was serving my country. You always chose work first. That sentence used to hurt me deeply. Not anymore. Because older age brings clarity, younger people sometimes lack. People who truly love you don't punish you for your purpose. They honor it. Daniel suddenly leaned forward again. You think another man's going to want this life? He asked bitterly. A woman in her 40s with health problems and military baggage. For years, words like that would have shattered me. Not now, because something inside me had fundamentally changed since the wedding. I no longer feared being alone more than being disrespected. And that changes everything. I stood slowly from the booth. Daniel looked startled. That's it? He asked. I nodded calmly. Yes. You're just walking away. I looked down at him quietly. You already walked away the moment you raised your hand. For once he had no clever response. No manipulation. No charm. Just silence. I left money on the table for my untouched coffee and walked toward the exit. But before I reached the door, Daniel called after me one last time. Rebecca. I turned slightly. And for the first time since I met him, he looked small. Not financially. Not socially. Spiritually. Emotionally. Just small. I did love you, he said quietly. I believed he thought that was true. But love without respect eventually becomes possession. And possession becomes resentment. I gave him a small nod. Then I walked out into the cold harbor air without looking back. Over the following weeks, the consequences continued spreading through Daniel's life. Several investors pulled out of his business ventures completely. The wedding video kept circulating online. Not viral nationwide, but enough. Enough for local damage, enough for whispers at country clubs, enough for people to quietly avoid invitations involving the Whitmore family. 2 former employees even contacted investigators regarding questionable financial practices tied to Daniel's company. Apparently, public exposure has a way of loosening old secrets. Linda reportedly blamed me for all of it. Of course she did. People like Linda never see consequences as the result of behavior, only betrayal. But strangely, none of it brought me satisfaction. Not real satisfaction. Because revenge, I learned, is rarely as healing as freedom. And freedom finally began arriving quietly in my life. Then one afternoon, nearly a month after the wedding disaster, I received a formal envelope from the Navy. Inside was an invitation. A retirement ceremony. Mine. After 21 years of service, the Navy planned to honor my career publicly in Norfolk. I stared at the invitation for a long time. And honestly, part of me considered not going at all. I almost didn't attend my own retirement ceremony. That probably sounds strange after spending 21 years in the Navy, but the truth is, I was tired. Not physically. Spiritually. The wedding disaster had drained something deep inside me. For weeks afterward, I moved through life quietly. I stayed off social media, ignored gossip, avoided unnecessary phone calls. I spent most mornings sitting on the small balcony of my temporary apartment near Norfolk Harbor, drinking coffee while cargo ships moved slowly through the gray Atlantic fog. And for the first time in decades, silence no longer frightened me. It comforted me. That realization alone changed my life, because for years I had mistaken noise for love, attention for connection, endurance for loyalty. The retirement ceremony was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at Naval Station Norfolk. Simple, traditional, respectful. Exactly the kind of ceremony older military officers appreciate. No unnecessary spectacle, just honor. I almost called to cancel twice that week. Part of me didn't feel worthy anymore after everything that happened. Funny how humiliation works. Even when somebody else hurts you, shame still tries attaching itself to your identity. But on the morning of the ceremony, I received a voicemail from Admiral Avery. Commander Lawson, he said warmly, you showed up for this country for 21 years. Let the Navy show up for you today. So I went. The October air carried that crisp coastal chill Virginia gets near the water. I wore my full-dress white uniform carefully for what would likely be the last official time. Every ribbon, every medal, every insignia polished perfectly. When I looked in the mirror before leaving home, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked weak, because I finally looked honest. No pretending, no shrinking, no apologizing, just me. The ceremony took place inside a modest naval auditorium overlooking the base. Rows of chairs slowly filled with officers, sailors, retired veterans, civilian staff, and a few close friends. Commander Elise Monroe sat near the front. Margaret Holloway came too, walking slowly with a cane beside her golden retriever service dog. Even seeing her there nearly brought tears to my eyes. And then something unexpected happened. People kept approaching me. Young officers, junior sailors, women especially, one after another. A lieutenant shook my hand and said, "You were the first female commander I ever saw leading overseas operations." A young communications officer quietly admitted, "You made me stay in the Navy when I thought I couldn't handle it anymore." Another woman said, "Thank you for proving women don't have to become smaller to lead." I stood there speechless, because for weeks I had focused only on what I lost. The marriage, the illusion, the future I thought I wanted. But I forgot something important. My life had mattered long before Daniel Whitmore entered it, and it would continue mattering after him too. The ceremony itself remained beautifully simple. Admiral Avery delivered the official remarks. He spoke about service, sacrifice, leadership under pressure. Then unexpectedly he paused and looked directly toward me. "There are officers who perform their duties," he said calmly. "And then there are officers who quietly carry other people through difficult seasons of life." The room stayed completely silent. Commander Rebecca Lawson spent 21 years protecting people under pressure without ever asking for recognition. I lowered my eyes briefly, because after everything that happened, being seen kindly again felt overwhelming. The Admiral continued, "She represents something increasingly rare in this world, steady character." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Steady character. Not perfection, not toughness, not achievement. Character. The audience stood for applause when the ceremony ended. Long, warm, sincere. And suddenly I realized something beautiful. The slap at my wedding had not destroyed my dignity. It revealed who never deserved access to it. A few months later, my life looked very different. Quieter. Smaller in some ways. Better in others. I bought a modest little waterfront cottage outside Norfolk with pale blue shutters and an old wooden porch facing the bay. Nothing extravagant. Just peaceful. I planted tomatoes in the backyard. Started taking slow evening walks again. Sometimes I sat near the marina for hours simply watching gulls circle above the water. No chaos. No criticism. No tension waiting beneath conversations. Just peace. And after years inside military structures and emotionally exhausting relationships, peace felt almost sacred. Daniel tried contacting me twice after the retirement ceremony. I never answered. Not from anger, from closure. There was nothing left to discuss. I later heard his business continued struggling after several investigations into financial misconduct expanded. Linda apparently blamed everyone except herself. But honestly, I stopped caring. That surprised me most of all. Because true healing begins the moment revenge stops feeling important. I still think about that wedding sometimes. The music stopping. The slap. The humiliation. The stunned faces around the ballroom. But strangely, those memories no longer feel like the ending of my story. They feel like the beginning of my freedom. And maybe that's the lesson I carry forward now. Sometimes life humiliates us publicly because we ignored private truths for too long. Pain has a way of forcing honesty into places comfort once protected. If you're listening to my story today while sitting in a quiet house, or recovering from heartbreak, or wondering whether peace is still possible later in life, please hear this from someone who learned it the hard way. It is never too late to stop abandoning yourself. Not at 40, not at 60, not ever. And if this story meant something to you, if part of it reminded you of your own life, your own strength, or your own second chance, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need that reminder too. Sometimes, one story can help another person finally choose themselves. "The will is clear," my father's lawyer declared. "She gets nothing." The judge nodded and reached for his gavel. I stood still as my father and brother clapped in celebration. Then I opened my folder, looked my father straight in the eye and said, "You forgot one thing." The entire courtroom went silent. Even the judge paused. My brother David's smile froze halfway across his face. My father, Richard Parker, leaned forward in his chair. For the first time that morning, he looked nervous. And that was exactly the reaction I had been waiting for. But before I tell you what was inside that folder, I need to explain how I ended up sitting in a probate courtroom in Franklin County, Ohio, being told I wasn't entitled to a single dollar from the man I loved most. My name is Emily Parker. I was 62 years old when this happened. For most of my life, I was the quiet one in the family. I worked as a public school librarian for nearly 35 years. I never became wealthy. I never owned a fancy house. I never drove luxury cars. I spent my career helping children discover books. And honestly, I was proud of that. My father never understood it. Richard Parker believed success could be measured by bank accounts, property, and status. My older brother David took after him. David worked in real estate. He loved talking about investments, profits, and deals. Family gatherings often felt like business meetings whenever those two were together. I was always the outsider, the disappointing daughter, the one who supposedly lacked ambition. Over the years, I learned to live with it. What mattered most to me wasn't my father's approval. It was my grandfather, Walter Parker. To me, he was simply Grandpa. He was the kindest man I ever knew. A Korean War veteran, a farmer, a husband who stayed faithful to one woman for 56 years, a man who never raised his voice but somehow commanded respect wherever he went. When Grandma died in 2010, something changed in him. He became quieter, lonelier. The family visited less often, especially my father and David. At first they came regularly. Then the visits became shorter. Then they became rare. I understood life gets busy. People have jobs, children, responsibilities. But Grandpa spent more and more evenings alone. So I started stopping by after work. At first it was once a week, then twice, then almost every day. I helped with groceries, doctor appointments, medication schedules, bills, the hundreds of little tasks that become difficult as people grow older. I never thought of it as sacrifice. I enjoyed our time together. Some of my happiest memories happened during those years. We'd sit on his front porch watching sunsets. He'd tell stories about farming during the 1950s, stories about Grandma, stories about mistakes he'd made, stories about America changing throughout his lifetime. He was wise enough to know that every generation thinks the next one is ruining the country, and wise enough to laugh about it. Meanwhile, my father and brother stayed mostly absent, except for holidays and discussions about money. I noticed it. Grandpa noticed it too, though he rarely complained. The last few years of his life became increasingly difficult. His health declined. Arthritis made walking painful. His eyesight weakened. There were hospital visits, specialists, physical therapy appointments. I was usually the one sitting beside him, holding paperwork, asking questions, making notes. Not because anyone asked me to, because somebody needed to do it, and because I loved him. About 3 years before his death, I remember a conversation that stayed with me. We were sitting in his kitchen drinking coffee, the same kitchen where he'd eaten breakfast nearly every morning for 50 years. He stared out the window for a long moment. Then he said something strange. "Emily, sometimes people show you who they are when they think you're no longer useful." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He smiled softly. "Oh, just an old man's observations." I didn't press him, but now I wish I had. Because looking back, I think he was trying to tell me something. Over the next few years, I noticed tensions growing beneath the surface. Whenever my father visited, conversations seemed strained. There were arguments behind closed doors, discussions that stopped whenever I entered the room. More than once I caught Grandpa looking exhausted afterward, but he never explained, and I respected his privacy. Then came the winter, everything changed. Grandpa suffered a serious fall. At 88 years old, recovery was difficult. He spent several weeks in rehabilitation. I visited nearly every day, sometimes twice a day. My father and brother came occasionally, usually for short visits. The nurses noticed. Families always think medical staff don't pay attention. They do. One afternoon, a nurse pulled me aside. "Your grandfather talks about you constantly," she said. I smiled. "He's always been kind." She shook her head. "No, it's more than that. He's grateful." That conversation stayed with me. A few months later, Grandpa came home. But he was never quite the same. Age was finally catching up with him. One evening, about 6 months before he died, he handed me a small brass key. I remember looking at it in confusion. "What's this for?" He smiled. "You'll know if you ever need it." I laughed. "That's not very helpful." "Life rarely is." I slipped the key into my purse and forgot about it. At the time, it seemed like another one of Grandpa's old-fashioned mysteries. I had no idea that tiny key would eventually change everything. Then, one quiet October morning, I got the call. Grandpa had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The grief hit harder than I expected. At 62, I'd lost people before. Friends, colleagues, my mother. But losing Grandpa felt different. It felt like losing the last person who truly saw me. The funeral was beautiful, simple, exactly the way he would have wanted. People from all over the county came to pay their respects. Farmers, veterans, neighbors, church members, former co-workers. The line stretched out the door. That alone should have told us something about the kind of man he had been. But after the funeral ended, something shifted. My father and brother suddenly became very interested in the estate. Lawyers appeared. Meetings were scheduled. Documents were discussed. And within weeks, I found myself sitting inside a probate courtroom, listening to my father's attorney explain why I deserved nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a dollar. Not an acre of land. Not even a keepsake. As if 30 years of love and loyalty had never existed. As if I had never mattered. Then came the moment that changed everything. I opened the folder resting on my lap. The folder containing something nobody in that courtroom knew existed. And as my father's smile began to fade, I finally spoke. You forgot one thing. The judge slowly lowered his gavel, and every eye in the room turned toward me. The judge lowered his gavel and stared at me. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. My father stopped smiling. David stopped clapping. Their attorney adjusted his glasses and looked at the folder in my hands. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the judge cleared his throat. Mrs. Parker, do you wish to present additional evidence? I do, Your Honor. My voice surprised even me. Calm. Steady. After all the years of being overlooked, ignored, and underestimated, I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I was simply ready. But before I handed over the documents, my mind drifted back through the years. Back to the long road that had brought me here. Because the truth was, nobody in that courtroom understood my relationship with Grandpa. Not really. They saw an old man who had accumulated wealth. I saw the man who taught me what mattered. Growing up, I was never my father's favorite. I don't say that with bitterness. It's simply the truth. Some families have dynamics that everyone quietly acknowledges, but nobody openly discusses. In ours, David was the golden child. He was athletic, confident, popular. The son my father always wanted. When David scored a touchdown, Dad celebrated. When David made money, Dad bragged about it. When David bought his first house, Dad told everyone at church. Meanwhile, I was the girl who liked books. The girl who spent Saturday afternoons in libraries. The girl who became a teacher and later a librarian. To my father, that seemed like settling for mediocrity. He never said it directly. But sometimes what people don't say speaks the loudest. I remember graduating from college. My father shook my hand. Not a hug. Not "I'm proud of you." Just a handshake. The kind you'd give a business acquaintance. Grandpa noticed. He always noticed. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside. Don't spend your life trying to earn approval from people who don't know how to give it. At 22, I didn't fully understand. At 62, I understood perfectly. Over the decades, my relationship with Grandpa only grew stronger, especially after Grandma died. The loneliness hit him hard. People often underestimate what happens when someone loses a spouse after 50 years of marriage. The house becomes quieter. Meals become smaller. Even simple routines feel different. Grandpa rarely complained, but I could see it. So I showed up. Not because I was expecting anything, because family should. Every Tuesday after work, I'd bring groceries. Every Friday, we'd have dinner together. Sunday afternoons became our tradition. Coffee, pie, conversation. Sometimes we'd talk for hours. Sometimes we'd simply sit on the porch and watch the world go by. Neither of us needed constant conversation. Comfortable silence can be a beautiful thing. My father and David still visited occasionally. But something had changed. The visits felt transactional. They usually arrived with questions. Questions about property, investments, bank accounts, land values, future plans. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular. Grandpa was 84. His arthritis was getting worse. Dinner had barely ended when David started discussing local real estate prices. Dad joined in immediately. Within minutes, they were talking about development opportunities and potential profits. Grandpa listened quietly. Finally, he looked at me and changed the subject. Emily, how's that reading program going at the elementary school? The contrast was impossible to miss. One conversation centered on money. The other centered on people. Later that evening, while washing dishes together, Grandpa shook his head. You know what worries me? What? Some people become so focused on inheritance that they forget the person is still alive. I looked toward the living room where Dad and David were discussing property values. You mean them? Grandpa smiled sadly. I didn't say that. But he didn't have to. As the years passed, I became more involved in helping him. Doctor appointments, insurance paperwork, prescription refills, tax documents, home repairs. The endless responsibilities that come with aging. I wasn't alone. There were neighbors who helped, church friends who checked on him. But I was the consistent one. The person who always answered the phone. The person who showed up. One winter evening, a snowstorm knocked out power across much of the county. Roads were nearly impassable. The temperature dropped into the teens. I bundled up, drove 20 miles through icy roads, and brought Grandpa a generator from my garage. When I arrived, he looked shocked. "You drove in this weather?" "Of course." He laughed. "You must be crazy." "Runs in the family." He smiled. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Emily, someday you'll understand that showing up matters more than people realize." At the time, I thought he was talking about kindness. Now I know he was talking about trust. About a year before he died, I began noticing subtle changes. Not in Grandpa, in Dad and David. Their visits became more frequent, more intense, more private. They'd close doors during conversations. They'd lower their voices when I entered rooms. Sometimes I'd catch fragments, words like attorney, assets, transfer, planning. Whenever I asked questions, they'd brush me off. "Nothing you need to worry about." Maybe they thought I wasn't paying attention. Maybe they thought I wasn't smart enough to notice. Either way, they were wrong. One afternoon after Dad and David left, Grandpa sat quietly at his kitchen table. He looked exhausted. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again. Finally, he sighed. Families can get complicated when money enters the conversation. I sat down across from him. "You don't have to deal with anything alone." His eyes softened. "I know." Then he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. A simple gesture, but one filled with meaning. Months later came the day he handed me the brass key. At the time, it felt random. Now looking back, I realize it was anything but random. He had already seen what was coming. He had already prepared. And somehow, without fully explaining why he had chosen me to carry part of that responsibility. After Grandpa died, I spent weeks grieving. The last thing on my mind was money. Then the legal notices started arriving. Probate filings, attorney letters, court schedules. And little by little, a disturbing picture emerged. Dad and David seemed unusually confident. Not sad, not reflective. Confident. As though the outcome had already been decided. As though they knew something nobody else knew. At first, I ignored the feeling. Then one evening, while sorting through some of Grandpa's personal belongings, I found the brass key again. The same key he had handed me months earlier. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. A memory surfaced. "You'll know if you ever need it." For the first time, I wondered if that moment had finally arrived. And that question led me to a locked metal box hidden exactly where Grandpa had once told me to look years earlier. The moment I opened it, my entire understanding of the family changed. And now, sitting inside that courtroom holding the contents of that box in my hands, I realized Grandpa had been preparing for this day all along. My hands were steady as I stood before the judge. That surprised me. A younger version of myself would have been terrified. For most of my life, confrontation made me uncomfortable. I preferred listening over arguing, understanding over fighting. But standing there in that courtroom, I wasn't speaking for myself alone. I was speaking for Grandpa, and somehow that made all the difference. The judge extended his hand. "What exactly do you have there, Mrs. Parker?" I carefully removed several documents from the folder. Documents recovered from a locked metal box belonging to my grandfather. Across the room, my father's expression darkened. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Their attorney immediately stood. "Your Honor, we object unless the source and authenticity of these documents can be established." The judge nodded. "A reasonable concern." Then he looked at me. "Can you explain how you obtained them?" I took a deep breath. 6 months before he passed away, my grandfather gave me a key. The room remained silent. He told me I'd know when I needed it. I held up the small brass key. The same one I'd carried in my purse for months without understanding its significance. After his death, I found a locked metal box hidden in a storage compartment inside his workshop. The judge studied me carefully. "And you're certain it belonged to him?" "Yes, Your Honor." My father suddenly stood. "That proves nothing." His voice carried a sharp edge. "Anybody could claim that." The judge raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Parker." Reluctantly, he obeyed. I continued. The box contained personal letters, financial records, and documents prepared by an independent attorney. The courtroom became even quieter. I noticed David looking at Dad. Dad looking at the lawyer looking increasingly concerned. That was the first moment I sensed they might already know what was coming. The judge accepted the folder. For several minutes he reviewed the contents without speaking. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody whispered. The tension was thick enough to feel. Finally he looked up. "Who is Attorney Michael Benson?" I recognized the name immediately. "He practiced estate law in Columbus." The judge nodded. "According to these documents, Mr. Benson represented your grandfather privately approximately 4 years ago." My father's attorney immediately frowned. "I've never heard of him." Neither had I. At least not before opening the box. But Grandpa had, and apparently he had trusted him. The judge continued reading. Then his eyebrows rose. That got everyone's attention. Judges aren't supposed to show much emotion. This judge suddenly looked interested. Very interested. "What exactly is it, Your Honor?" my father's lawyer asked. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned several more pages. Then he looked directly at my father. "Mr. Parker, were you aware your father retained independent legal counsel regarding his estate?" My father's face turned pale. Just for a second. But I saw it. The judge saw it too. "No," Dad answered. Too quickly. Too firmly. The kind of answer people give when they're trying not to think. The judge said nothing. He simply returned to reading. Inside my heart was pounding. Because this was the first time I had actually seen the documents examined by someone with authority. Until now I'd only known what I had read alone at my kitchen table. The night I opened the box remained vivid in my memory. I had driven home after finding it, made coffee, sat down at my dining room table, and spent nearly 6 hours reading every page. By midnight, my entire understanding of Grandpa's final years had changed. The documents revealed something shocking. Several years earlier, Grandpa had become concerned about financial activity involving some of his accounts. Not because money was missing exactly, at least not at first. Because things didn't add up. Transfers, withdrawals, transactions, changes that confused him. Changes he hadn't fully understood. The records suggested he began asking questions. Questions that apparently led nowhere. According to letters written in Grandpa's own handwriting, he had become increasingly worried that family members were making financial decisions without fully explaining them to him. He never directly accused anyone. That wasn't his style. But the concern was obvious. One letter contained a sentence I couldn't forget. "I fear I am being treated as a wallet rather than a father." Reading those words had broken my heart. Because they sounded exactly like the loneliness I'd witnessed during his final years. The judge eventually reached another document. This time he stopped reading entirely. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. Then he looked up. Interesting. My father's attorney immediately stepped forward. "Your Honor." The judge removed his glasses. "There appears to be a trust." The room froze. I heard David inhale sharply. My father stared at the judge. "What trust?" The words escaped before he could stop himself. The judge looked directly at him. "That's precisely the question. A trust. Those 6 letters changed everything. Most people think a will controls everything after death. Many don't realize trusts often operate separately, outside normal probate proceedings, and according to the documents in front of the judge, Grandpa had established 1 year earlier. Quietly. Privately. Without telling most of the family. The judge continued reviewing pages. "This trust appears substantial." Substantial. Another word that changed the atmosphere. My father's attorney was visibly rattled now. He requested permission to inspect the documents. The judge allowed it. As the lawyer flipped through the pages, I watched the confidence drain from his face. Page after page. Document after document. His expression grew more serious. Finally, he sat down beside my father. They whispered urgently. Dad looked stunned. David looked sick. For the first time all morning, they no longer appeared certain of victory. The trust wasn't the only discovery. There were letters. Detailed letters. Correspondence between Grandpa and Attorney Benson. Notes documenting concerns. Descriptions of meetings. Records showing careful planning. Most importantly, there was evidence suggesting Grandpa intentionally structured portions of his estate outside the will. Why? Because he feared his wishes might not be respected otherwise. The realization hurt. Not because of the money. Because it revealed how worried he had become. How alone he must have felt while making those decisions. The judge eventually closed the folder. "I will not issue a ruling today." Nobody spoke. "This court requires time to verify these materials." My father's attorney immediately objected. But his voice lacked conviction now. The judge wasn't interested. I am ordering a temporary suspension of final probate decisions pending further review. The gavel struck. A sharp crack echoed through the courtroom. Just like that, everything changed. The hearing ended. People began standing, gathering papers, whispering among themselves, but nobody left immediately. Everyone seemed to understand something important had just happened. As I packed my folder, my father approached me. His face was red, angry, confused, afraid. "What did you do?" The question almost made me laugh. For 62 years, I'd been the daughter nobody worried about. The quiet one, the harmless one. Now suddenly he wanted answers. I looked at him calmly. "I didn't do anything." His jaw tightened. "You planned this?" "No." I shook my head. "Grandpa did." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I walked past him and headed toward the courthouse exit. Outside, the Ohio afternoon felt strangely bright. The air smelled like fresh rain, and for the first time since Grandpa died, I felt something unexpected. Not victory, not revenge. Hope. Because somewhere inside those documents was the truth. And whether my father liked it or not, that truth was finally starting to come into the light. 3 weeks after the courthouse hearing, the investigation officially began. Looking back, that was the moment my father and brother stopped treating the situation as a minor inconvenience and started realizing they might have a serious problem. Until then, they had assumed the trust documents were some forgotten technicality, a speed bump, a delay, nothing more. They were wrong. The probate court appointed an independent examiner to review the estate records, the trust documents, and several years of financial activity connected to Grandpa's accounts. What nobody expected was how much information those records would uncover. Least of all me. I spent most of those weeks at home waiting for updates. At 62 years old, I wasn't interested in courtroom drama. I wasn't glued to my phone hoping somebody would be exposed. I simply wanted the truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. Still, every few days my attorney would call. Each conversation seemed to reveal something new, something troubling. One afternoon she invited me to her office. I arrived carrying a notebook and a cup of coffee. The moment I sat down, I could tell something significant had happened. "Emily," she said carefully, "the financial review is raising questions." "What kind of questions?" She slid several documents across her desk. "Questions about transparency." I studied the papers. Most of them meant very little to me at first. Bank statements, transfer records, authorization forms, spreadsheets, columns of numbers. But my attorney patiently explained what investigators were seeing. Over a period of several years, various financial transactions had occurred involving Grandpa's assets. Many were perfectly legal. Some appeared unusual. Others seemed difficult to justify. The issue wasn't necessarily theft. At least not yet. The issue was whether Grandpa fully understood what was happening, and whether he had received accurate information before agreeing to certain decisions. That distinction mattered enormously, especially in estate law. "What does this mean?" I asked. "It means investigators are digging deeper." For the first time, I felt genuinely sad. Not angry, sad. Because regardless of what happened next, this involved my family. No daughter wants to imagine her father taking advantage of an elderly parent. No sister wants to believe her brother may have crossed ethical lines. Yet the evidence kept growing. A few days later, another development surfaced. Several caregivers who had worked with Grandpa during his final years were interviewed. One of them remembered something interesting. She recalled Grandpa expressing frustration after financial meetings. Another remembered him asking questions about paperwork he didn't fully understand. Neither statement proved wrongdoing, but together they painted a picture. A picture of an elderly man trying to keep up with complicated financial matters while his health slowly declined. Then came the neighbors. People underestimate neighbors. They see things. They remember things, especially in small-town Ohio. One longtime neighbor told investigators she often saw me visiting, sometimes daily. She rarely saw my father. She rarely saw David. Another neighbor remembered Grandpa complaining not about money but about pressure. Pressure to make decisions. Pressure to sign documents. Pressure to discuss the future. Again, none of it was explosive. But piece by piece, the puzzle was changing. Then attorney Michael Benson entered the picture. The independent attorney Grandpa had secretly hired. Until that moment, he had almost seemed like a ghost. A name on documents. A signature. A memory preserved in paper. Now he became very real. Though retired, Benson agreed to cooperate. His records were meticulous. Every meeting documented. Every conversation summarized. Every recommendation preserved. When my attorney showed me copies, I sat speechless. Grandpa had been far more deliberate than anyone realized. Years earlier, he had expressed concerns about protecting his estate, not from strangers, from conflict, from family disputes, from exactly the kind of situation now unfolding. One memo written by Benson stood out. I still remember the sentence. Walter Parker wishes to ensure his assets benefit individuals he trusts, rather than individuals who merely expect to inherit. I read it 3 times, then a 4th. Not because of the money, because it sounded exactly like Grandpa. Direct, fair, honest. As the investigation continued, pressure began building on my father and brother. Friends started asking questions. Church members started whispering. Nothing spreads faster in a small community than uncertainty. For decades, Richard Parker had been viewed as a respected local businessman. Now people weren't sure what to think. I wasn't celebrating. Honestly, I hated it. Humiliation doesn't feel nearly as satisfying as people imagine, especially when it involves someone you once loved. One evening, my phone rang unexpectedly. It was David. The first time he'd called me in months. I almost didn't answer, but I did. "Emily." His voice sounded strained. "What do you want?" A long pause followed. Then he sighed. "You need to stop this." I laughed softly. That surprised him. "What exactly am I stopping?" "You know what I mean." "No, David." For the first time in years, I spoke plainly. "I didn't create this situation. You're making Dad look bad." "No." I stared out my living room window. "Whatever is happening right now, Dad created himself." Silence, then another sigh. Finally, he hung up. That conversation told me everything I needed to know. Because if they truly believed they had done nothing wrong, they wouldn't have been worried. The biggest breakthrough arrived 2 weeks later. My attorney called early on a Thursday morning. Her voice sounded different, excited. "Emily, we found something." My stomach tightened. "What?" "A property document." I drove to her office immediately. When I arrived, she handed me a copy. The moment I started reading, I understood why she sounded excited. Years before his death, Grandpa had transferred significant property interests into the trust. Legally, properly, with witnesses, with attorney oversight. The paperwork appeared airtight. Yet somehow my father and brother had either overlooked it or assumed nobody would ever discover it. The document changed everything. Entire sections of the estate no longer belonged in probate. They belonged to the trust, which meant they would follow trust instructions, not the will. For several moments, I simply stared at the pages. Grandpa had anticipated every move, every challenge, every argument. Not because he was paranoid, because he understood people, especially people he had known all his life. A final hearing was scheduled for the following month. By then, the investigation would be complete. The evidence would be reviewed. The court would decide. As I left my attorney's office that day, I felt the weight of the past few months settling over me. The truth was finally coming into focus. And the closer we got to the final hearing, the more obvious it became that Grandpa's last plan had worked exactly as he intended. The only question remaining was how my father and brother would react when the full truth was revealed in open court. The final probate hearing took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in late April. I remember standing outside the courthouse for several minutes before walking in. The rain fell steadily onto the sidewalks of downtown Columbus. People hurried past holding umbrellas. Traffic moved slowly through the wet streets. For everyone else, it was an ordinary day. For my family, it was the day everything would finally be decided. I arrived early. Years of working in schools had taught me the value of punctuality. My attorney was already there reviewing notes. She greeted me with a reassuring smile. "You ready?" I took a slow breath. As ready as I'll ever be. The truth was, I wasn't nervous about losing anymore. That fear had disappeared weeks earlier. What I felt instead was sadness. The kind that comes when you realize a family may never be the same again. My father and brother arrived together about 15 minutes later. The difference between today and the first hearing was impossible to miss. Gone were the confident smiles. Gone was the celebrating. Gone was the certainty. Dad looked older. Much older. His shoulders seemed lower. His face looked tired. David wasn't much different. The months of investigation had taken a visible toll on both of them. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for them. Then I remembered Grandpa sitting alone in that farmhouse, waiting for visitors who rarely came, and my sympathy became more complicated. The hearing began promptly at 9 o'clock. The same judge entered, the same courtroom, the same wooden benches, yet the atmosphere felt completely different. This time, everyone knew something important was about to happen. The judge reviewed several procedural matters first. Then he turned his attention to the investigation findings. For nearly an hour, evidence was presented. Financial records, trust documents, attorney correspondence, witness statements, property transfers. Each piece added another layer to the story. None of it was dramatic in the television sense. No shocking confessions. No surprise witnesses bursting through doors. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, the truth emerged slowly, methodically, like a photograph developing over time. The independent examiner explained his findings. His conclusion was straightforward. Walter Parker had legally established a trust years before his death. The trust had been properly funded. The property transfers were valid. The documentation was complete. Most importantly, the trust operated independently from the will. That single fact changed everything. My father's attorney tried to challenge portions of the report. He argued that certain intentions remained unclear. He questioned interpretations. He raised technical objections. But with each challenge, another document seemed to appear. Another record. Another signed statement. Another piece of evidence confirming Grandpa's wishes. The foundation was simply too strong. Then Attorney Benson's records were introduced. The retired estate attorney wasn't present in person that day, but his files spoke clearly enough. Meeting notes, memorandums, signed acknowledgments, detailed explanations of why Grandpa had chosen the structure he did. The judge spent considerable time reviewing those records. At one point, he removed his glasses and looked directly toward my father. The room became very quiet. "Mr. Parker," he said carefully, "it appears your father took extensive steps to ensure his intentions would be honored." Dad didn't answer. He simply stared at the table. For the first time in my life, I saw something in him that looked remarkably like regret. The hearing continued. The trust instructions were reviewed. When the details were finally read into the record, the room seemed to hold its breath. Grandpa had indeed left portions of his estate to my father and brother. He hadn't disinherited them. Not entirely. But they would receive far less than they had expected. The majority of the trust assets were directed elsewhere. Some to charitable causes, some to community programs, some to specific purposes Grandpa had carefully outlined. And yes, a substantial portion had been entrusted to me. Not because I was the favorite, not because I was his granddaughter, because according to his own written words, I had consistently demonstrated responsibility, honesty, and commitment to family without expectation of reward. Hearing those words nearly broke me. For months, everyone had focused on money. But sitting there, I wasn't thinking about assets. I was thinking about Grandpa, about the porch conversations, the coffee, the doctor visits, the winter storms, the ordinary moments that had quietly built trust over decades. Suddenly, none of this felt like a legal victory. It felt like a final conversation. A message from Grandpa reaching across time. The judge eventually delivered his ruling. The trust would be upheld. Its provisions would be honored. The probate estate would proceed according to the remaining legal documents. Case closed. Just like that, months of uncertainty ended in a matter of minutes. The gavel struck. The sound echoed through the courtroom. Nobody celebrated. Not me. Not my attorney. Not even the people who had supported my position. Because despite everything, this wasn't a happy ending. It was simply the truth. As people began gathering their belongings, I remained seated. The emotional weight of the moment settled over me. I thought I would feel triumphant. I didn't. I felt tired, relieved, grateful, but not triumphant. My father slowly stood. For several seconds, he simply stared at the floor. Then he looked toward me. Our eyes met across the room. There was no anger there now. No arrogance. No victory. Just an old man confronting consequences he never expected. David looked equally defeated. The confidence that had defined him for years seemed to have vanished. Neither of them approached me. Neither said a word. And honestly, I was thankful for that. There was nothing left to argue about. The documents had spoken. The court had spoken. Most importantly, Grandpa had spoken. As I prepared to leave, the judge said something unexpected. Not formally, not as part of the ruling, simply as one human being speaking to another. Estate cases often reveal what families value most. He paused, then added quietly, "Sometimes that's money, sometimes it's trust." Those words stayed with me long after I left the courthouse. Because deep down I knew he was right. The real inheritance had never been the money. The real inheritance was the trust Grandpa had placed in me. And that was something no court could create and no one could take away. For the first few days after the court ruling, I did almost nothing. Not because I was overwhelmed by paperwork, There was plenty of that. Trust administration, property records, financial accounts, meetings with attorneys and accountants. The work seemed endless, but that wasn't what occupied my mind. What occupied my mind was Grandpa. The court case was over. The arguments were over. The uncertainty was over. And for the first time since his death, I had space to grieve. Real grief. The kind that arrives after the noise fades away. One Saturday morning, I drove out to the farmhouse. The same farmhouse where Grandpa had spent most of his life. The same front porch where we had watched countless sunsets together. The place felt strangely peaceful, almost as if the land itself had been waiting for the conflict to end. Spring had arrived. The fields were beginning to turn green again. Birds moved through the trees. A light breeze carried the familiar smell of soil and fresh grass. I sat on the porch for nearly an hour. No phone. No paperwork. No legal discussions. Just silence. And memories. For the first time, I realized something important. Throughout the entire court battle, I had been fighting to protect Grandpa's wishes. But I had never stopped to ask myself what I wanted. The answer surprised me. I didn't want revenge. Not anymore. The court had already handled the legal issues. Anything beyond that would only create more pain. What I wanted was to honor the trust Grandpa had placed in me. Nothing more. Nothing less. That realization shaped every decision that followed. Over the next several months, I worked closely with advisors to organize the trust assets. There were investment accounts, rental properties, farmland, various financial holdings. Enough that I could have spent the rest of my life focused entirely on money if I wanted. But that idea held no appeal. I had spent 35 years as a librarian. I knew what mattered to me, and surprisingly, it wasn't wealth. One of the first decisions I made involved the farmland. Several developers expressed interest in purchasing portions of it. The offers were generous, very generous. Many people would have accepted immediately. But I remembered countless conversations with Grandpa, the pride he felt when talking about that land, the history connected to it, the generations who had worked it. Selling it felt wrong, so I didn't. Instead, I arranged long-term agreements that would allow local farming families to continue using the land while preserving it for the future. When I signed the paperwork, I could almost hear Grandpa's approval. Another portion of the trust funded something even closer to my heart: education, specifically reading programs. I established several small scholarships for local students pursuing careers in teaching library science and education. Nothing extravagant, just enough to help. The kind of practical assistance that changes lives one person at a time. At the first scholarship ceremony, I watched a young woman accept an award while fighting back tears. She was the first person in her family to attend college. As she thanked everyone involved, I found myself thinking about Grandpa again. He would have loved that moment. More than any courtroom victory. More than any financial statement. Because helping people had always mattered more to him than impressing them. Then something happened that I never expected. One evening nearly 8 months after the court case ended, my phone rang. The caller ID showed David's name. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I answered. Hello? For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then my brother cleared his throat. Emily. His voice sounded different. Softer. Older somehow. I owe you an apology. I remained silent. Not because I wanted to punish him. Because I genuinely didn't know what to say. David continued. I spent a lot of time blaming everyone else. Another pause. But the truth is, Grandpa saw things more clearly than I did. I looked out the window. The sun was beginning to set. Orange light filled the room. I miss him too, I said quietly. The line remained silent for several seconds. Then David answered. Yeah. His voice cracked slightly. That single word told me everything. For the first time, we weren't arguing about money. We were talking about loss, about regret, about family. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. It didn't magically repair decades of distance. Life isn't that simple. But it was a beginning, a small one. And sometimes small beginnings matter most. My relationship with my father proved more complicated. Richard never offered a full apology, at least not directly. Pride can become a heavy burden as people age. Some never learn how to set it down. Still, over time, the hostility faded. Occasionally, we'd speak on holidays. Sometimes about family. Sometimes about the weather. Sometimes about nothing important at all. The conversations remained cautious, but they were civil. At my age, I had learned that not every wound heals completely. Some simply stop bleeding. And that's enough. Nearly a year after the case ended, I returned to the farmhouse one final time to sort through a few remaining personal belongings. Most had already been distributed. Only a handful of boxes remained. Old photographs, letters, family records, the ordinary treasures people leave behind. Inside one box, I found a small envelope. My name was written on the front in Grandpa's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. The note inside was short, very short. Only a few paragraphs, but I still carry a copy today. One section stood out above all others. If you're reading this, then events probably unfolded the way I feared they might. I smiled sadly. Even then, Grandpa had understood. The letter continued. Money has a way of revealing character. Some people chase it, some people protect it. The rarest people are those who remember it isn't the point. My eyes filled with tears. Then came the final sentence. The sentence I think about most often. The greatest inheritance isn't property. It's knowing who you are when property is taken away. I sat there for a long time afterward, holding the letter, watching the evening light fade through the farmhouse windows. Eventually, I understood the lesson Grandpa had spent years teaching me. The court case was never really about money. It was about trust, character, presence, the quiet choices people make when nobody is watching. Those choices become our legacy, not our possessions, not our titles, not our bank accounts. Years later, when people ask about the case, they usually want to hear about the courtroom victory, the surprise trust, the legal battle, the reversal of fortune. But those aren't the parts I remember most. I remember coffee on the porch, conversations at sunset, a brass key, a grandfather who showed up for people, and who taught me that the strongest form of wealth is integrity. If this story made you think about someone who quietly showed up for you during difficult times, take a moment to remember them today. And if you've ever learned that character matters more than inheritance, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of the people you love while they're still here. Everyone stand for the Admiral. The words cracked through the chapel like cannon fire. For half a second, nobody moved. Then 300 people surged to their feet all at once, chairs scraping polished hardwood crystal glasses, trembling on white linen tables. The organist froze mid-note. Across the room, my father's face drained of color. His mouth hung open, the same mouth that had spent 35 years telling me I'd never amount to much if I kept playing soldier. And there I stood in the center aisle of St. Matthew's Chapel in Charleston, South Carolina, my white navy dress uniform catching the candlelight, 4 silver stars gleaming on my shoulders. For the first time in my life, my father had nothing to say. But to understand why that silence mattered, you have to understand the kind of man Walter Mercer had always been. And the kind of daughter he never wanted. It had started 3 hours earlier at the rehearsal dinner. Charleston in late spring always feels dipped in honey. Warm air drifted through the open windows of the Harbor Club ballroom, carrying the scent of salt water and magnolia blossoms from the Battery. The city had dressed itself beautifully for our wedding weekend. Inside, crystal chandeliers glowed over 24 round tables draped in ivory linen, gold-rimmed china, tall floral centerpieces of white roses and eucalyptus. The sort of expensive Southern elegance my mother had spent 6 months arranging down to the last folded napkin. My fiancé Daniel Whitaker had wanted something smaller. But my father insisted, if my daughter's finally doing something respectable with her life, he'd announced we ought to make it worth seeing. He'd said it smiling. People laughed. That was Walter Mercer's gift. He could humiliate you while sounding charming enough that everyone thought they were supposed to laugh. I stood near the ballroom entrance, smoothing the front of my white dress jacket. It was formal navy issue immaculate, pressed to perfection, brass buttons polished bright enough to reflect light. And yes, the 4 stars were there. I'd earned every one of them. The official public announcement had only come 2 days earlier. Most of Washington already knew. So did Navy leadership. My family had not. Mostly because none of them ever asked about my career beyond whether I planned to settle down soon. I'd told Daniel months ago I wasn't sure about wearing the uniform to our rehearsal dinner. He'd taken both my hands and smiled that quiet, steady smile that made everything feel possible. Claire, he said you gave 30 years to this country. Don't spend your wedding weekend pretending that part of you doesn't exist. I loved him for that. Still do. That evening I'd stood in the mirror upstairs, staring at my reflection longer than usual. 34 years old, hair pinned neatly at the nape of my neck, minimal makeup, a face lined not by age but by responsibility. The sort of face command gives you. Not glamorous, Not soft enough for my mother's standards, not polished and sparkling like my younger sister Vanessa, who had inherited every ounce of Southern beauty my father valued. I looked like what I was. A woman who had spent most of her adult life carrying burdens heavier than herself and learning how not to bend under them. When I entered the ballroom, conversation dipped. Heads turned. And for one brief, impossible moment, I thought maybe my father would finally look at me and feel pride. Instead, he laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. He was standing near the bar, bourbon in hand, perfectly tailored navy blazer stretched over his broad frame. At 68, Walter Mercer still looked imposing, silver at the temples, square-jawed, the kind of man who made people listen the second he entered a room. He gave me a slow once-over and smirked. "You're actually wearing your uniform." The nearby guests turned toward us. I forced a small smile. "Yes, sir." He chuckled and shook his head. "God, Claire, at your own wedding rehearsal? How embarrassing." A few people laughed politely. Vanessa perched beside him in pale pink silk, pressed manicured fingers to her lips to hide her grin. Oh, Daddy, let her have her little moment. Little moment. Funny phrase for 30 years of service. My mother glanced down at her wine glass. She said nothing. She rarely ever did. I felt heat rise into my chest, but years in command had taught me how to let anger settle cold. I walked closer, met my father's eyes, and said evenly, "I'll wear what I earned." That sharpened his expression. Walter Mercer didn't like resistance. Not from employees, not from my mother. Certainly not from me. "You always did enjoy making people uncomfortable," he said. I smiled faintly. "No, Dad. I just stopped making myself smaller so you could feel bigger." The silence around us deepened. Vanessa's smile faltered. My mother looked up sharply. And for the first time all evening, my father looked uncertain. Only for a second. Then he scoffed and turned back toward the bar. "Well," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "let's hope tomorrow your little costume doesn't distract from the bride." There it was. The final reminder. Even at my own wedding, in his mind, I was still a child playing dress-up. Not a woman. Not a leader. Not someone worth seeing clearly. Daniel appeared at my side, then warm hand slipping gently into mine. "You okay?" I looked up at him. His calm gray eyes held mine steady as open water. And something inside me settled. "Yes," I said. Because suddenly, strangely, for the first time I realized I didn't need my father's approval to walk forward. Tomorrow I would step into St. Matthew's Chapel exactly as I was. No apology, no explanation. And whether Walter Mercer understood what those 4 stars meant or not, someone in that room would. I had no idea just how right that feeling was, or that before the next evening ended, my father's entire understanding of his daughter would collapse in front of 300 witnesses. I barely slept that night. Not because of nerves about the wedding, and not because of what my father had said at the rehearsal dinner. After 30 years in uniform, words had long ago stopped being able to wound me the way they once had. Experience teaches you that people can only diminish your worth if you hand them the authority to define it. Still, old habits linger, and Walter Mercer had spent a lifetime teaching me to doubt what I'd earned. I woke just after 4:30 to the familiar stillness that always comes before dawn. The Whitaker estate sat on a stretch of old Charleston waterfront where the Ashley River caught first light like brushed silver. Daniel's family had owned the property for generations, a sprawling federal-style home with broad porches, ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, and enough history in its walls to make silence feel sacred. I stood at the bedroom window in my robe and watched the sky lighten. For years, mornings like this had belonged to deployments. Quiet preparation, mental inventory. Breathing slow and steady before responsibility settled onto your shoulders for another day. Funny how your body remembers duty even when your life is changing. Today I was getting married, and somehow that felt more intimidating than any command transfer I'd ever accepted. Behind me, Daniel stirred beneath the covers. "You're up early," he murmured. I smiled. "I've been accused of worse." He rolled onto one elbow, his sandy hair unruly from sleep, his expression still carrying that boyish kindness that had first disarmed me 6 years earlier at a Navy fundraiser in Annapolis. Daniel Whitaker had the unusual gift of making space feel calm. It was one of the reasons I'd fallen in love with him. He looked at me for a moment, then sat up straighter. "You're thinking about him." I didn't have to ask who. "Yes." Daniel nodded once. Then he pulled back the covers and crossed the room barefoot, stopping beside me at the window. For a while, neither of us spoke. Outside, the first gulls drifted over the water. Finally, he said quietly, "Claire, you know he's wrong." I gave a small laugh. "I know. Then why does it still hurt? That question stayed between us for several seconds. Because it was honest. And because Daniel had always known how to ask the questions I usually avoided answering. I folded my arms. Because part of me still keeps waiting for him to become the father I thought he might be someday. Daniel's reflection softened in the glass. That little girl deserved better. I closed my eyes briefly. Yes, she did. I was 8 the first time I understood my father wished I'd been someone else. Vanessa had just won Little Miss Charleston. My mother had thrown a celebration dinner with neighbors and church friends. Everyone praised her curls, her smile, her poise. At some point, I'd run into the dining room holding my science fair ribbon. 2nd place. I'd been so proud. "Daddy, look what I won." He barely glanced over. Then smiled absently and said, "That's nice, sweetheart, but don't interrupt your sister's moment." Everyone had laughed softly. Not cruelly, just enough for an 8-year-old girl to understand she'd misunderstood her place. That was Walter Mercer's way. He didn't shout often, didn't rage, didn't strike. He simply withheld warmth with such precision that you spent years trying to earn what was never coming. Vanessa fit his world beautifully. She was graceful, social adored attention the way flowers adore sunlight. And to be fair, she wasn't cruel by nature. She simply learned early that my failures made her shine brighter. Children adapt to whatever love rewards. I adapted differently. I stopped seeking applause and started chasing competence. Grades, athletics, leadership. Then Annapolis. The day my acceptance letter arrived, my mother cried. Vanessa clapped politely. My father looked over his reading glasses and said, "The military, Claire, that's hardly a future for a woman." I was 17. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, something inside me hardened cleanly in that moment. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Then I suppose I'll have to build one." It was the first honest thing I ever said to him. He never forgave me for it. At 8 sharp, there was a knock at the door. Daniel smiled. "Your cavalry." I opened it to find Margaret Whitaker, Daniel's mother, holding a silver tray with coffee and toast. She wore soft blue linen and the kind of warm smile only women who've truly lived can give. Well, she said America's most intimidating bride looks underfed. I laughed despite myself. Margaret stepped inside and set the tray down. Then her expression gentled. "Claire, may I tell you something?" "Of course." She touched my arm lightly. "When Daniel first told us about you, my father Thomas asked what branch you served in. The second he heard your name, he went quiet." I frowned. "Why?" Margaret smiled carefully. "He said he wanted to meet you before explaining." That gave me pause. Thomas Whitaker was 82 and one of the most decorated retired admirals in modern Navy history. He'd commanded fleets before I'd even graduated high school. I'd met him only twice before. Each time he'd looked at me with a curious intensity I hadn't understood. Before I could ask more, Margaret simply said, "Wear your uniform proudly today." Then she left, and somehow those words steadied me more than she probably knew. By noon, I stood alone in the dressing room at St. Matthew's Chapel. The white dress blues fit perfectly. Every seam exact, every brass button polished. The 4 stars rested on my shoulders with the quiet weight of sacrifice. They weren't decoration. They were memory. Lives lost. Lives saved. Years carried. 1,000 impossible decisions no one would ever know I'd made. I studied my reflection. Not as Walter Mercer's daughter. Not as someone still hoping to be chosen. But as the woman I had become despite him. Then the chapel bells began to ring. It was time. And as I reached for the door, I had the strangest certainty that before this day ended, my father would finally see exactly who had been standing in front of him all along. There are moments in life when time does something strange. It slows. The world sharpens. And you know without understanding how that what happens next will divide your life into before and after. That was how it felt standing outside the doors of St. Matthew's Chapel. The bells had just finished ringing. Inside, 300 guests were settling into polished oak pews beneath vaulted ceilings that had stood over Charleston for nearly 2 centuries. Candlelight shimmered against stained glass windows. White roses lined the aisle. Somewhere beyond the doors, the organist played the opening notes of Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring, and I stood there alone in my white navy dress uniform, gloved hands steady at my sides, 4 silver stars bright against my shoulders. A young chapel attendant glanced at me nervously. "Admiral Mercer," I smiled faintly. "You can call me Claire today." His ears reddened. "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated, then added quietly, "My mother served under you on the Roosevelt. She always said you were the finest officer she ever knew." For a moment I just looked at him. The sincerity in his expression touched something unexpectedly tender inside me. "Tell your mother thank you," I said. His smile widened. Then the music shifted. It was time. He reached for the brass handle, and the doors opened. The chapel seemed to inhale. 300 faces turned toward me all at once, and for the first few steps down that aisle there was only stillness. The soft rustle of fabric, the measured click of my shoes against old wood, the low breath of Charleston air moving through open side windows. I kept my eyes forward. That was years of military discipline. You don't scan a room when entering command presence. You move with purpose and let people absorb what they need to absorb. But even without looking directly, I could feel it. Confusion, curiosity, recognition from some, shock from others. A low murmur moved through the pews like wind through reeds. Because while many of Daniel's family friends recognized the uniform immediately, very few expected to see 4 stars, especially on a woman my age, and certainly not on the bride. Halfway down the aisle, I saw my father. Walter Mercer sat in the second row beside my mother, his face frozen in a confusion so complete it almost looked childlike. For once he had no polished reaction ready. His eyes moved over the stars on my shoulders, then back to my face, then to the stars again, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the daughter he'd spent his life dismissing. Beside him, Vanessa leaned forward, her lips parting slightly. "What is this?" she whispered. Mother didn't answer. She was staring at me as though seeing me clearly for the first time. And then I saw Daniel, waiting at the altar in his black tuxedo, hands clasped before him, his expression steady and warm. Not surprised, not confused, just proud. That smile reminded me to breathe. I kept walking. Then everything changed. Front row left side. Thomas Whitaker, 82 years old. Broad-shouldered despite his age, his silver hair perfectly combed his posture, still carrying traces of the command that had once shaped entire fleets. Retired Admiral Thomas Whitaker had the kind of presence that didn't diminish with age. Men still straightened unconsciously when he entered a room. As I approached, his face shifted. At first, polite attention, then recognition, then something far deeper. His entire body went still. Not ordinary surprise. Recognition of something impossible. His pale blue eyes fixed on the stars at my shoulders, and I watched understanding strike him with physical force. Slowly he rose to his feet. The motion was deliberate enough that nearby guests noticed immediately. Conversation stopped. Thomas Whitaker did not stand casually. At 82, every movement carried intention. He reached down, set his crystal water glass carefully on the pew rail, then turned toward the center aisle and looked directly at me. There was reverence in his face now, and something else. Memory. My pulse quickened. He stepped into the aisle. Someone murmured, "What's happening?" He ignored them. Instead, he walked calmly to the front lectern where the chapel microphone rested. The organist faltered into silence. The entire room watched. Thomas adjusted the microphone with one practiced hand. Then he looked out across the chapel. His voice, when it came, was deep enough to fill every corner. "Ladies and gentlemen," the room stilled completely. He drew one slow breath, and then thundered, "Everyone stand for the Admiral." For half a heartbeat, no one moved. Then instinct took over. Military men first. Retired officers. Veterans. Then their wives. Then everyone else rose with them, chairs scraping sharply against old floors. 300 people standing at once. The sound echoed like rolling thunder. Gasps rippled through the chapel. My mother rose slowly, trembling. Vanessa looked around wildly, trying to understand. And my father remained seated for one stunned second longer than anyone else, his face gone ghost white. Then even he stood. Because in that room, under the authority and Thomas Whitaker's voice, there was no other choice. The silence that followed felt sacred. Thomas turned toward me fully now, and before anyone could process what was happening, the retired admiral raised his right hand in a flawless military salute. The sharpness of it stole the breath from the room. Then, one by one, every veteran present followed. Rows of salutes lifted toward me. Perfect. Silent. Absolute. 300 people standing. Dozens saluting. And my father staring at his daughter as if he had never seen her before. Thomas lowered his hand, his eyes never leaving mine. Then he spoke words that would change everything. "Admiral Claire Mercer," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Now the United States Navy still stands because of what you did in the Pacific, and behind me somewhere near the chapel doors." I heard my father whisper, "My God." For a long moment no one moved. 300 people stood frozen beneath St. Matthew's vaulted ceiling, the candlelight trembling across their faces. Dozens of raised salutes remained suspended in the air, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Thomas Whitaker stood at the microphone, his face pale with memory. He looked older in that moment than he had even minutes before. Not weak, never weak, but burdened by the sudden weight of years. The kind of look men get when history rises unexpectedly to meet them. He swallowed once. Then he looked directly at me and said more softly this time, "You never told them." I held his gaze. "No, sir." He gave a slow nod as if that answer confirmed something he had long suspected. Then he turned back to the room. The old command returned to his posture instantly. For 82 years, Thomas Whitaker had carried himself like a man who understood duty. Even age hadn't taken that from him. He adjusted the microphone slightly and let his eyes move across the chapel. "Most of you know me as Daniel's uncle," he said. A nervous ripple of laughter moved through the guests. He did not smile. "But before that, I served 41 years in the United States Navy. I commanded fleets in waters most people here couldn't locate on a map. I've watched brave men die. I've buried boys who became heroes too late for the world to thank them." The room grew still again. Thomas drew a breath, and in all my years of service, I have met exactly 3 officers I believed were born for command. He turned slowly toward me. "Admiral Claire Mercer is one of them." The words seemed to hang in the air like struck metal. Behind him, Daniel's mother pressed trembling fingers to her mouth. Across the aisle, my own mother looked suddenly unsteady, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath her. My father stood rigid, his face empty with disbelief. Thomas continued. 7 years ago, the USS Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Group entered restricted waters in the Western Pacific under direct threat of coordinated hostile action. At that, a few retired officers in the room visibly stiffened. They remembered. Of course they remembered. The incident had dominated quiet military circles for months afterward. Publicly, almost nothing had been released. Official statements described it as a navigational conflict successfully resolved through tactical command. That was one way to describe it. The truth was very different. Thomas looked at the room carefully, as if weighing what could now be said. The Roosevelt was seconds from catastrophic engagement. Communications were compromised. Enemy targeting systems had already locked. A woman near the back gasped softly. Thomas's voice lowered. "My son was executive officer aboard that carrier." He paused. And when he spoke again, his voice roughened. "We believed he was already dead." I felt the old memory rise sharp and unwelcome. Salt, heavy air. Red emergency lighting. The low scream of failing systems. The impossible arithmetic of command when every option costs lives. I had been 27. Too young according to nearly everyone senior to me. But command does not ask your age when it places lives in your hands. Thomas looked back at me now with something close to awe. Lieutenant Commander Mercer assumed emergency tactical authority after senior command was lost. She made a decision no textbook would have sanctioned. His pale eyes gleamed. She moved directly into hostile range. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Yes, I had. Every protocol said retreat. Every calculation predicted disaster. But retreat would have exposed the carrier's vulnerable flank long enough for complete annihilation. So I had done the only thing left. Advanced, fast enough and hard enough to disrupt targeting lock and force manual recalibration. It gave the Roosevelt 6 minutes. 6 minutes to restore systems and fire defensive countermeasures. 6 minutes that saved over 4,000 American sailors, including Thomas Whitaker's son. Thomas's voice shook openly now. She saved an entire carrier group. The chapel had gone so silent I could hear the faint crackle of candle wicks. He turned fully toward my father then, and his face hardened. "Do you understand what that means, Mr. Mercer?" Walter's lips parted. No sound came out. Thomas stepped closer. "Your daughter was offered every commendation our government could lawfully bestow. She refused public recognition because classified details remained active. She accepted silence because duty required it." His voice sharpened. "And while this nation entrusted her with fleets, you mocked her uniform over dinner." The words struck like physical blows. My father flinched. Actually flinched. I had never seen that happen. Not once in 34 years. He opened his mouth again. Nothing. For all his practiced charm, all his easy authority, Walter Mercer had no defense against truth spoken plainly. Vanessa's face had gone white. She looked from Thomas to me and back again as though trying to reconcile childhood memory with reality. My mother began to cry silently. Not dramatic tears. The quiet kind women cry when regret arrives too late to disguise itself. Then Thomas surprised everyone. He turned back to me, and with visible effort, this 82-year-old legend of the United States Navy straightened to perfect attention. Then he saluted again. "This country owes you more than it can repay, Admiral." Behind him, every veteran present snapped back into salute, perfectly synchronized. The sound of sleeves shifting filled the chapel. It was the most profound honor of my life. Not because of rank, not because of recognition, but because after 30 years of silent service, someone had finally spoken the truth aloud. And there, standing among Charleston's old wealth and polished appearances, my father had been forced to hear it. Walter stared at me with naked confusion, as though searching his memory for every moment he had dismissed me, and realizing one by one what they had cost him. Then his face crumpled. Just slightly, enough to reveal the frightened old man beneath the pride. And in a voice so low only the nearest Rose could hear, he whispered, "Claire, why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him calmly, and for the first time in my life, answering him felt easy. "Dad, I said you never asked?" The silence after my words seemed to settle over St. Matthew's like dust after a storm. "You never asked." The sentence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Some truths arrive softly enough that people lean toward them, and then discover too late that they've been struck clean through. My father stood motionless in the second row, his mouth slightly open, his face stripped of all the easy confidence he had worn for as long as I could remember. Walter Mercer had spent his entire life controlling rooms. He controlled business meetings with polished certainty, controlled dinner conversations with sharp humor, controlled family gatherings through that subtle pressure. Only powerful men seemed to master that quiet understanding that everyone else should orbit whatever mood they had chosen for the evening. And now, for the first time I had ever witnessed, he had lost command completely. The room felt it. 300 people stood suspended in that strange stillness where everyone senses history shifting, but no one knows what comes next. Thomas Whitaker slowly lowered his salute. The veterans followed. Then he stepped back from the microphone and looked toward me, offering a small nod. The floor was mine now. I drew one steady breath, and turned fully toward my father. For years I had imagined this moment. Not this exact setting, perhaps not the chapel, not the guests, not the impossible public reckoning, but some version of this confrontation had lived quietly in the back of my mind for decades. In every version I'd thought I would feel triumphant, vindicated, victorious. But standing there now looking at the old man who had shaped so much of my pain, all I felt was sadness. Not sharp sadness, not angry sadness, just the kind that arrives when illusion finally gives way to truth. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Walter Mercer was still broad-shouldered, still dressed in immaculate Navy tailoring, still carrying the handsome authority Charleston society had admired for decades. But the force inside him, the certainty that had always made him seem larger than life, had cracked. And beneath it stood only an aging man confronting the limits of his own understanding. His voice came rougher than I had ever heard it. "Claire," he stopped, swallowed, tried again. "Why would you keep something like this from your family?" The old reflex was there even now. Shift blame. Make himself the injured party. Several years ago that question would have trapped me. It would have sent me scrambling to explain, justify, soften. Not anymore. I answered calmly. "I didn't keep anything from you." His brow tightened. "Yes, you did." "No, Dad." My voice stayed even. "You simply never cared enough to know." A quiet murmur passed through the chapel. Walter blinked hard as though physically struck. Vanessa stepped forward from beside him, her voice tight with disbelief. "That's ridiculous." She looked at me the way she always had when uncomfortable chin, slightly raised eyes narrowed with practiced superiority. "You can't seriously blame Dad because you chose to live halfway across the world and never tell anyone what was happening." For a brief moment I saw the little girl she used to be, the child who learned early that our father's approval was conditional, and who had spent her whole life performing for it. She wasn't cruel. Not really. Just afraid. And fear often wears the face of arrogance. I met her gaze. "Vanessa, do you remember my promotion ceremony in Norfolk?" Her expression flickered. "That was years ago." "Yes." I nodded once. "You and Dad promised you'd come." Her face changed. Not much, but enough. Because she remembered. Of course she remembered. It had been the day I took command of my first carrier strike group. One of the proudest days of my life. I'd reserved seats for my family, waited for them before the ceremony began, checked my phone between formalities. Nothing. Hours later, I received a text from Vanessa. "Sorry, Daddy forgot. We had brunch with the Pembrokes and lost track of time." "Congratulations, though." That was all. No call. No apology. Nothing. Vanessa looked away first. My father's face tightened. That was one missed event. It was every event. The words came before I could stop them. Not shouted. Not angry. Just true. And truth spoken plainly can silence a room faster than rage ever could. I took a slow breath. "You missed my academy graduation because Vanessa had a pageant luncheon." His jaw clenched. "You missed my first command ceremony because your golf club hosted some charity banquet." His eyes dropped. "You missed my promotion to Rear Admiral because you and Mother were in Palm Beach for a fundraiser." Neither of my parents spoke. The years hung there between us like laundry no one could pretend not to see. My mother wept openly now. Her shoulders shook with the kind of restrained grief Southern women spend lifetimes mastering. Still, she said nothing. That was her tragedy. She had built her whole life around peacekeeping so carefully that eventually she forgot peace. Without honesty was just surrender wearing pearls. Walter looked at her, then back at me, and suddenly he looked old. Not 68, ancient, like a man seeing his life from the wrong end and realizing too late what mattered. His voice cracked. I thought. He stopped. Whatever defense he had meant to offer collapsed before it reached air. For several seconds he simply stood there searching my face for something familiar. Maybe the little girl who once chased his approval. Maybe the daughter who would rush to reassure him. But she was gone. And in her place stood the woman his neglect had accidentally forged. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. I didn't know. I held his gaze. And with more peace than pain, I answered. That was your choice. The words settled over him like judgment. Not cruel. Not loud. Final. And in that moment, I understood something unexpected. This wasn't revenge. Revenge would have required anger. This was freedom. Because standing there in that chapel with 300 witnesses and my father's certainty in ruins, I realized I no longer needed anything from him. Not apology. Not pride. Not recognition. Nothing. And somehow losing that need felt like finally setting down a burden I had carried since childhood. But I didn't yet know the hardest part was still coming. Because 20 minutes later, my father would find me alone in the chapel's side parlor and say the words I had waited my whole life to hear. The chapel slowly emptied into the warm Charleston evening. Guests drifted toward the reception hall in hushed clusters, their voices carrying that strange mixture of excitement and restraint people use when they know they've witnessed something unforgettable, but haven't yet decided how to talk about it. Through the open doors, I could hear faint music beginning across the courtyard. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose carefully, almost respectfully. Life was moving forward. As it always does. I stood alone in the side parlor just off the chapel sanctuary, staring out the tall windows at the fading gold light stretching across the church gardens. St. Matthew's had always kept this room quiet. Even as a child, I remembered thinking it felt like the sort of place where truths ought to be spoken. Soft cream walls, a grandfather clock ticking in patient rhythm, a vase of fresh white lilies resting on a polished walnut table. The air carried that familiar scent of old wood and flowers beginning to open under evening warmth. For the first time all day, I let myself breathe. The adrenaline had finally begun to fade, leaving behind an odd stillness. Not exhaustion. Something gentler. Relief, perhaps? A lifetime of waiting had ended in that sanctuary. And now I wasn't entirely sure what came next. Behind me, the door opened quietly. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. My father had always entered rooms carefully when uncertain. A hesitation before crossing the threshold. As though permission mattered only when he feared it might not be granted. I kept my eyes on the window. For several seconds he said nothing. Then his voice came lower and rougher than I had ever heard it. Your mother's gone to freshen up. It was such an ordinary thing to say that for a moment I almost smiled. Walter Mercer had always reached for practicality when emotion frightened him. Yes, I said. Silence again. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside a woman laughed. Then he cleared his throat. Claire. I turned. And for the first time in my life, my father looked afraid. Not socially uncomfortable. Not irritated. Not embarrassed. Afraid. His shoulders seemed narrower somehow. His face had softened under the weight of whatever this moment required of him. Even his hands, those large, confident hands that had built a Charleston real estate empire from almost nothing, hung uncertainly at his sides. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a language he had never learned to speak. For years I had imagined this moment too. My father finally coming to me stripped of certainty, finally choosing honesty over pride, and in every imagined version I had believed I would savor it. Instead, seeing him this way only made me sad. He took a slow breath. When you were little, he said you used to follow me everywhere. The words caught me off guard. He gave a faint, broken smile. You were always asking questions. About everything. Why the sky changed colors at sunset. Why boats floated. Why old houses leaned after storms. His eyes glistened. You wanted answers for everything. I said nothing, because he was right. I had followed him constantly as a child. Back when I still believed fathers naturally loved daughters. Back when I thought if I learned enough, impressed him enough, became enough, he would finally look at me the way he looked at Vanessa. With delight, he looked down. I remember once you were maybe 9, you came running into my office with some little model ship you'd built. The memory hit instantly. Popsicle sticks. Blue paint on my fingers. I had worked for days. Daddy, I'd said, look, I made a destroyer. He had barely glanced up from paperwork, then said, that's nice, sweetheart. Why don't you go help your mother with something more appropriate? I remembered the sting of it even now. He closed his eyes briefly. I saw your face fall, he whispered. A tear slipped down my mother's daughter-trained cheek before I could stop it. He looked up sharply. I knew I'd hurt you. That surprised me more than anything. All these years I had assumed he simply hadn't noticed. His face tightened. I noticed every time. The room seemed to tilt around me. He stepped closer. Claire, I need you to understand something, even if it doesn't excuse anything. His voice shook. My father was a hard man. I said nothing. I knew enough of my grandfather to believe it. Walter stared past me toward the window, seeing decades backward. He believed weakness was fatal. Kindness made men soft. Praise made children useless. His mouth tightened. And when you were born, for the first time his composure nearly broke. You were so fierce, so bright, so certain of yourself. His eyes met mine, and it terrified me. I frowned. Terrified you? He nodded once. Because I knew the world would punish that kind of strength in a woman. The confession landed heavily between us. He swallowed hard. I thought if I made you tougher first, life couldn't. For several seconds I simply stared at him. And then the truth arrived. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Understanding. He had not withheld love because I lacked worth. He had withheld it because fear had made him cruel enough to mistake injury for protection. I spoke softly. No, Dad. He looked up, and I said the truest thing I had ever spoken to him. You were the hurt. The words struck him harder than anger ever could have. His breath caught. His face crumpled completely. And then Walter Mercer, the proudest man I had ever known, began to cry. Not politely, not discreetly. The kind of helpless, ugly grief men spend lifetimes avoiding. He covered his mouth with one trembling hand, and wept for everything he had broken. I stood still and let him. After a long time, he lowered his hand. His voice was shattered. I'm sorry. No defense. No qualification. No explanation. Just truth. And somehow that made it enough. I stepped closer. Not to comfort him. Not yet. But to release myself. It's too late for you to raise me, I said quietly. He nodded through tears. But it's not too late to know me. His face broke again. And this time when he reached for my hand, I let him take it. Just for a moment. Long enough for both of us to understand that forgiveness is not forgetting. It is simply choosing not to carry yesterday into tomorrow. A knock sounded at the door. Daniel's voice came gently through the wood. Claire, it's time. I looked once more at my father, and for the first time in 34 years, I saw not the man I had feared disappointing, but simply a flawed old man being offered one final chance to become better. Then I turned toward the door, toward my future, and my father followed behind me in silence. The evening light had softened by the time I stepped back into St. Matthew's sanctuary. Charleston sunsets have a way of making everything look touched by grace. Gold poured through the stained glass windows and stretched across the old oak pews in ribbons of amber and rose. Dust motes drifted like tiny lanterns through the warm air. The chapel had settled into a hush again. The earlier shock had passed. The murmurs had faded, and what remained now was something quieter. Reverence, perhaps, or maybe understanding. Daniel stood at the altar exactly where I had left him, waiting, steady as ever. When his eyes met mine, I saw no trace of surprise or prideful triumph over what had happened. Only love, pure and unshaken. That was Daniel's gift. He never needed my accomplishments to define me. He had loved me before he knew the full story of my career. Before the promotions. Before the public announcement. Before tonight's revelation turned me into something larger than life in the eyes of 300 people. To him, I had always just been Claire. And after a lifetime of being either too much or not enough for the people who raised me, that kind of love felt almost holy. The organ began again softer this time. I took my first step down the aisle. And then something happened I hadn't expected. As I passed the second row, my father stood. Not because Thomas Whitaker had ordered it. Not because custom demanded it. He simply rose on his own. Slowly. Deliberately. And as I drew level with him, Walter Mercer lifted his right hand in a quiet military salute. Perfectly rendered. He must have practiced it somewhere in those last 20 minutes. The gesture was imperfect in its precision. His elbow slightly low, his wrist not quite exact, but its meaning was unmistakable. Respect. Not performance. Not pride. Recognition. For 34 years I had waited for my father to see me. And there, in the warm hush of St. Matthew's Chapel, he finally did. I paused. Only for a second. Then I gave him the smallest nod. Not absolution. Not dismissal. Simply acknowledgement. His eyes filled. And I walked on. Some wounds never disappear entirely. But they do heal enough to stop ruling your life. That was what I understood as I reached the altar and took Daniel's hands in mine. His fingers were warm and steady. His smile softened. "You okay?" he whispered. I smiled back. Better than okay. And for the first time in my life I meant it without qualification. The ceremony itself passed in a kind of beautiful blur. The minister spoke of covenant and grace, of building a life not on perfection but on faithfulness. Daniel's vows made half the chapel cry. Mine nearly made him cry. When we promised ourselves to one another beneath the fading Charleston light, I felt something inside me settle permanently into place. Not excitement. Not relief. Peace. The kind of peace that arrives only when you stop asking the past to become different and finally allow yourself to step forward. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, the applause rose warm and full around us. And this time when I turned toward the congregation, I wasn't searching for my father's face. I didn't need to. That was the miracle. For most of my life, every success had carried an invisible question. Will this finally be enough for him? Enough medals, enough rank, enough sacrifice, enough proof. But standing there beside my husband, sunlight falling across my white uniform, I realized I had finally laid that question down. And in its place was something far stronger. I was enough long before he learned how to see it. The reception carried on late into the Charleston night. Laughter spilled across the riverfront lawn. String lights glowed in the live oaks. Jazz drifted from the bandstand while guests danced beneath the stars. At one point, Thomas Whitaker joined me near the terrace railing overlooking the water. He held a glass of bourbon and smiled toward the crowd. "You handled tonight better than most admirals I know would have." I laughed softly. Years of diplomatic training. He gave me a sideways look. "Number." His voice gentled. "Years of character." That meant more than I can explain. We stood quietly for a moment. Then he said, "You know your father will spend the rest of his life trying to understand what he nearly missed." I looked across the lawn. Walter stood near my mother beneath the lanterns, speaking more softly than I had ever seen. Not fixed. Not transformed overnight into some perfect man. Just trying. And somehow that was enough. I think I said carefully, "That's his journey now, not mine." Thomas smiled. "Exactly right." Later that evening, after the final dance, Daniel and I slipped away toward the garden path behind the chapel. The night air smelled of salt and magnolia. The city glowed softly beyond the trees. And for the first time since childhood, I felt entirely unburdened. Not because my father had changed. Not because the room had stood for me. Not because the truth had finally been spoken aloud. But because I had stopped needing any of it to know who I was. That's the lesson life teaches us if we live long enough. Some people may never see your worth. Some may see it too late. And some, if grace allows, may finally open their eyes just before the end. But your value was never waiting for their permission. It was yours all along. If this story touched something in your own life, if you've ever spent years trying to earn love that should have been freely given perhaps tonight, is your reminder to set that burden down. And if you found meaning here, I hope you'll share this story with someone who might need it. And stay with us for more stories about second chances, quiet strength, and the long road home. Because sometimes the life we were meant to live begins the moment we stop asking for approval and simply step into the light. Daniel squeezed my hand. The chapel doors closed softly behind us, and together we walked forward,